Hey, it's Linda, and this is Coffee and Crime. This podcast explores real cases involving violence, loss, and the darker side of human nature. Some details may be confronting. Listener discretion is strongly advised. For almost 10 years, it had been nothing more than an unsolved file. A brown folder sitting on a shelf inside New South Wales Police headquarters. The handwriting on the cover had faded. The corners had curled up. Inside were photographs, statements, sketches, dental charts, and newspaper clippings, all documenting one of Australia's most baffling murder investigations. The unidentified woman in the newspaper had been named the Pyjama Girl. Over the years, detectives had followed hundreds of leads. Women reported missing across New South Wales. Women reported missing across Victoria. Travellers, factory workers, waitresses, housewives. Every possible identification had been compared, investigated, and one by one ruled out. Eventually, the investigation slowed. The file wasn't officially closed. It had simply stopped moving. Like so many cold cases, it had reached a point where every known avenue had been exhausted. And then, in late 1943 and early 1944, something changed. A fresh team of detectives was tasked with reviewing unsolved homicide files and comparing them again with long-standing missing persons reports. Instead of accepting previous conclusions, they were instructed to question them. And that meant returning to investigations that had stalled years earlier and asking a simple question. What if something had been missed? The Pyjama Girl file was one of those cases. No new body had been found. No witness had suddenly come forward. No forgotten piece of physical evidence had appeared. Instead, investigators reopened the file because they believed the original investigation deserved another look. Sometimes the biggest breakthrough isn't finding new evidence. It's looking at the old evidence differently. To understand why detectives returned to the case in 1944, you have to go back almost 10 years. Saturday, the 1st of September, 1934. Just west of Albury, near Splitters Creek and Howlong Road, a local farmer named Thomas Griffiths was walking along the side of the road with one of his prize bulls. The path was familiar, the morning was ordinary, until he noticed the smell. Not wood smoke, not the lingering scent of a campfire, something heavier. He followed it toward a concrete drainage culvert running beneath the road, and inside, partially concealed beneath a Hessian grain sack, lay the body of a young woman. The burns were severe. Large areas of her body had been charred, and her face had suffered extensive damage. At first glance, identifying her was impossible. Yet one detail stood out immediately. She was wearing yellow silk pyjamas decorated with a Chinese dragon motif. In Depression-era Australia, they were striking, expensive, and unusual. Within hours, newspapers had given the unidentified victim a name that she would never choose: the Pyjama Girl. Police from Albury arrived and they immediately recognised they were dealing with far more than an accidental death. Crime scene preservation in 1934 looked very different from today. There was no forensic response vehicle, no laser scanners, no DNA collection. Instead, detectives relied on careful observation. Photographs documented the position of the body before anything was moved. Investigators measured distances from fixed landmarks, and the surrounding ground was searched for footprints, tyre marks, and discarded items. Every piece of clothing was examined where it lay before being removed. Even in the early 1930s, experienced detectives understood that once a scene was disturbed, it could never be recreated exactly how it had been found. They worked slowly because they had only one opportunity to record it. As the body was examined, another important discovery was made. Although the fire had destroyed much of the soft tissue, an X-ray later revealed a bullet lodged in her neck. That single finding changed the direction of the investigation. This wasn't simply a body destroyed by fire. The woman had suffered violent injuries before the burning occurred. The fire, investigators believed, was likely an attempt to conceal the crime rather than the cause of death itself. Exactly what sequence of injuries occurred couldn't be established with certainty. The body was transported for examination. Modern audiences often assume forensic pathology in the 1930s worked much as it does today, but it didn't. Medical examiners could identify fractures, gunshot wounds, and obvious trauma. They could estimate age, height, and build, but there was no DNA, no mitochondrial testing, no isotope analysis, no CT scanning, and no digital facial reconstruction. Even determining the exact sequence of injuries after extensive fire damage could be extraordinarily difficult. Investigators relied on a combination of pathology, witness evidence, and elimination. Sometimes identifying the victim was harder than identifying the killer. Post-mortem established that the woman had died violently. The burns were significant, but they were not enough to explain every injury. The bullet remained one of the strongest pieces of physical evidence. Beyond that, many conclusions remained cautious rather than definitive. Fire had destroyed evidence that investigators simply could not recover. And that uncertainty would follow the case for the next decade. At first, detectives believed someone would recognise her quickly. The silk pyjamas were memorable. The case received extensive newspaper coverage. Photographs and descriptions were circulated throughout Australia, and missing persons reports poured in. Dozens of families believed that the unidentified woman might be someone they had loved. One by one, detectives investigated every lead. One by one, they were eliminated. Weeks became months. Months became years. And despite enormous public interest, the woman in the yellow silk pyjamas remained unnamed. Then, police took a step that would be almost unimaginable today. Believing public recognition offered the best chance of identification, the woman's body was preserved in formalin and transferred to the University of Sydney. Members of the public were permitted to view the remains in the hope that someone would recognise her. It was a decision driven by desperation. It remains one of the most extraordinary investigative methods ever used in Australia. Hundreds of people came through, but no confirmed identification followed. For detectives, every unsuccessful viewing meant the same thing: that the investigation wasn't moving forward. It was at a standstill. By the late 1930s, the investigation into the unidentified woman found near Albury had reached a pause. Not closure, not resolution, just stagnation. The case file still existed. It still moved through administrative systems, and it was still technically open. But without a confirmed identity, it had no direction. And without direction, it had no momentum. And that is how most large unidentified death investigations of the period ended up. Not solved, but suspended in storage. In 1934, forensic practice, identity depended on a narrow set of comparisons. Dental charts, physical characteristics, clothing recognition, and missing persons reports. But each of these depend on something fragile: consistency between systems. And in this case, consistency did not exist. Dental records varied between practitioners. Missing persons files were not centrally indexed, and photographic comparison was subjective. Once an initial comparison excluded a potential match, that decision tended to persist. Not because it was necessarily correct, but because it had already been recorded. The reopening of the Pyjama Girl case in 1944 did not begin with a dramatic discovery. It began with a review. Australian authorities periodically reassessed older unresolved files to check for missed identifications. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that they chose to re-examine. Investigators began comparing unidentified death records from the 1930s, missing persons reports that had never been fully resolved, and cases where earlier exclusions had been based on incomplete dental interpretation. The Pyjama Girl case reappeared because it had one critical feature: a preserved body that had already been documented, and that made it unusually reviewable. Most cold cases degrade over time, but this one had not disappeared. One of the key breakthroughs in 1944 was not new evidence. It was a rereading of old evidence differently. The original dental exclusion had been treated as conclusive. But when investigators revisited the charts, they identified a problem common in early forensic dentistry. There was no standardised national system of notation. Different practitioners recorded tooth positions differently, restorations inconsistently, and anatomical references without uniform structure. So when the charts were re-evaluated, what had been treated as a mismatch was reassessed as a non-definitive comparison error rather than an exclusion. And that distinction mattered, because it meant that the earlier conclusion was not absolute. It was conditional. And conditional exclusions can be overturned. Once the exclusion barrier was removed, investigators returned to the missing persons files from Victoria. Among them was a case of Linda Agostini, who had disappeared in 1934. The timeline alignment was significant. Disappearance in Melbourne area, body discovered in rural New South Wales shortly after, and lack of confirmed sighting between events. Investigators compared physical descriptors from missing reports, surviving post-mortem notes, clothing descriptions, and timeline proximity. Unlike earlier comparisons, this one was not filtered through a prior exclusion. It was evaluated fresh and it matched. The unidentified Pyjama Girl was formally identified as Florence Linda Agostini in 1944. Once identity was confirmed, the investigation changed category. It was no longer an unidentified death. It became a domestic homicide investigation. Attention immediately turned to her husband, Antonio Agostini. Investigators reconstructed his known movements, reported marital tensions from witness accounts, disappearance timeline correlation, and the ability to travel between jurisdictions. This stage of the investigation was less about discovery and more about alignment. Police were not looking for a new suspect. They were testing whether the existing timeline supported involvement. Under questioning, Antonio Agostini provided an account. He described a domestic dispute, an escalation of conflict, and that death occurred during that confrontation, and subsequently he concealed the body. He admitted transporting the remains after death and acknowledged burning the body in an attempt to conceal what had occurred. However, the precise mechanism of death was not reconstructed with certainty. At the time, investigators relied heavily on his statement, physical evidence at the recovery site, and injury interpretation from the post-mortem. The case proceeded to trial in the Supreme Court of Victoria, and the Crown case was built on 3 pillars: identity confirmation of the deceased, post-mortem findings indicating a violent death, and the accused's own admission regarding concealment. Witness testimony established background context around the relationship, describing it as unstable, but no witness directly observed the fatal event. This created a legal boundary. The prosecution could argue involvement, but they could not fully eliminate alternative interpretations of how death occurred. The defence argued lack of intent to kill. They focused on absence of eyewitness evidence, limitations in forensic reconstruction due to the fire, and the uncertainty around exact sequence of trauma. The jury ultimately returned a verdict of manslaughter. Antonio Agostini was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment, a punishment reflecting responsibility for death, but not legal certainty of murder intent. By the end of 1944, the Pyjama Girl case was formally closed in investigative terms. Not because every question had been answered, but because the legal threshold had been reached. Identity confirmed, cause of death classified, responsibility legally determined. What remained outside resolution was not evidence of guilt or innocence. It was the limitation of reconstruction itself. Fire damage had removed detail that no later investigation could fully recover. The surviving record of the Pyjama Girl investigation is not a mystery narrative. It's a file built across 2 decades of incomplete forensic capabilities. Every stage of the case reflects the tools available at the time, and every conclusion is shaped by those tools. The case did not remain unsolved because nothing was known. It remained unsolved for so long because what could be known was limited by what the system of the time could reliably confirm. By the time Pyjama Girl reached the Supreme Court of Victoria in 1944, the investigation had already shifted twice. Just from unidentified death to identified victim. Then from discovery file to homicide prosecution. What remained was no longer uncertainty about who she was. It was a question of what the evidence could actually prove. Not every case finds closure. Not every question gets answered. And sometimes the truth stays buried long after the headlines fade. This has been Coffee and Crime AU. For deeper into the case, visit Coffee and Crime AU online. Until next time.